You've entered void of rules, a realm where normal constraints cease to exist. But beware, traveller, there is one rule here. You've got to hit subscribe. Seriously, it's the only rule we have. We just reached 1,000 brave souls, and we're hunting for 9,000 more to complete our dark ritual. I mean, reach our next goal, so subscribe. Or don't. But remember, the void remembers those who defy the only rule. Now let's get into today's video. I'm bleeding out in the back of my own ambulance, watching something that wears my face tear through reinforced steel like wet paper. My radio crackles with a transmission from 3 hours ago. My own voice, younger and stupidly confident. Unit 47 responding to Raven's Hollow Road. The irony would be funny if I weren't dying. But let me start at the beginning, because the end only makes sense if you understand how I got here. How a single moment of human decency became my death sentence in these godforsaken mountains. My name is Connor Blake. 6 months ago, I thought I was escaping to paradise. I'd been working Atlanta's trauma units for 2 years. Gunshot wounds at 3 a.m. Overdoses in back alleys where the rats watched you work. Stabbings that painted the ambulance walls arterial red. The city was eating me alive, one bloody call at a time. I was developing the 1,000-yard stare that veteran paramedics get. The hollow look that comes from seeing too much death and not enough hope. My last call in Atlanta had been a 5-year-old girl, victim of a drive-by shooting. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong world. I'd worked on her for 47 minutes, pushing drugs and shocking a heart that kept stopping, while her mother screamed prayers in Spanish that God either couldn't hear or chose to ignore. We lost her 3 blocks from the hospital. That night, I sat in my apartment with a bottle of bourbon and a loaded service revolver, wondering if there was any point in continuing this charade. The gun felt heavy in my hands, heavier than it should have been, like it was full of all the lives I'd failed to save. That's when I saw the job posting for Mountain Ridge Emergency Services in West Virginia. Good pay, clean air, small community where you could actually make a difference. The description mentioned unique local challenges, which I figured meant dealing with moonshine poisoning and the occasional hunting accident. Looking back, I realized the universe has a sick sense of humor. I drove up to West Virginia on a Tuesday morning in early April, following winding mountain roads that seemed to spiral inward like a shell. The closer I got to my destination, the older everything looked. Not just old, ancient. The mountains themselves felt like sleeping giants, their peaks shrouded in mist that never quite burned off, even in the afternoon sun. Cell service died somewhere around mile marker 27. GPS followed soon after, leaving me with handwritten directions and landmarks like turn left at the burned church and continue past the 3 dead oaks. The road signs were few and far between, most of them riddled with bullet holes or so faded by weather that they were illegible. The Mountain Ridge Emergency Services station squatted in a valley so narrow the sun only hit it for 3 hours a day. The building looked like it had been constructed in the 1950s and hadn't been updated since. Cinder block walls painted institutional green, windows that rattled in their frames whenever the wind picked up, and a roof that probably leaked in 12 different places. 2 ambulances sat in the bay, both Ford vans that had seen better decades. The newer one, and I use that term loosely, looked like it was from the late 1990s. The older unit had body damage that suggested it had been in several serious accidents with mismatched panels and a windshield spiderwebbed with cracks. But it was the atmosphere that hit me first. The station felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. Too quiet, too cold, like it was holding its breath. The air tasted metallic, and there was an underlying smell I couldn't identify. Something organic and unpleasant, like flowers left too long in a vase. Meredith Hawkins was waiting in what passed for a break room, smoking a cigarette despite the no smoking signs plastered on every wall. 23 years she'd worked these mountains, and it showed in every line of her weathered face. Her grey hair was pulled back severe enough to stretch her features, and her eyes held secrets that most people would pay therapy bills to forget. She looked me up and down with the calculating gaze of someone evaluating livestock. "You're the new kid from Atlanta," she said. It wasn't a question. "Connor Blake," I said, extending my hand. "Looking forward to working with you." She didn't shake it. Instead, she stubbed out a cigarette and placed the blood-stained notebook on the scarred wooden table between us. The leather cover was worn smooth in places, cracked and stained with substances I couldn't identify and didn't want to contemplate. "Before we go any further," she said, "you need to understand something. These mountains aren't like anywhere else you've worked. The rules are different here. Physics works differently. Logic is optional." I laughed, actually laughed. "Come on, what is this? Some kind of initiation thing for the city boy?" Her expression didn't change. If anything, it got colder. "Open the book." Inside, 19 rules were written in different handwritings. Some were in careful script that suggested education and precision. Others were scrawled desperately, as if written in a hurry. A few looked like they'd been carved with fingernails, the paper gouged and torn. "Every paramedic who's worked these mountains added to that book," Meredith said, her voice rough as sandpaper. "The ones who didn't follow it, well, some of these rules are written in their blood. Literally." She opened to the first page and began reading in a monotone that made my skin crawl. "Rule 1, never respond to calls on Crow Mountain between midnight and 3 a.m, regardless of emergency type or dispatch instructions. Rule 2, if you encounter fog that moves against the wind, turn around immediately and return to base. Rule 3, when examining patients, if their pupils reflect light like an animal's eyes, do not make direct eye contact and complete treatment as quickly as possible." The list continued, each rule stranger than the last. Rule 5, if you hear your own voice on the radio, before speaking, drive immediately to the nearest running water and remain there until sunrise. Rule 7, never enter a house where all clocks have stopped at the same time. Rule 8, if a patient's temperature reads exactly 66.6 degrees Fahrenheit 3 times in a row, abandon the call immediately. My medical training rebelled against every word. This is insane. We can't abandon patients because of superstition. Superstition? Meredith pulled out her phone, scrolled to a photo, and slid it across the table. It showed a paramedic uniform laid out on forest ground, surrounded by yellow crime scene tape. Empty. The fabric was torn from the inside, as if something had clawed its way out rather than in. Dark stains that looked suspiciously like blood covered most of the shirt. The name tag read, D. Chen. "David was my last partner," she said, pulling the phone back. "Brilliant kid, Johns Hopkins graduate, could diagnose conditions that stumped attending physicians with decades of experience. Photographic memory, steady hands, and the kind of compassion that made him perfect for this job. He lasted exactly 28 days. She lit another cigarette, her hands steady, despite what she was telling me. "We found his uniform scattered across 4 counties, never found David. But here's the thing, he kept showing up at calls after that. Same face, same voice, same medical knowledge. Even had his memories, his mannerisms, everything that made him David." The smoke curled between us like an accusation, except for one small detail. David was left-handed, always had been since he was a kid. The thing wearing his face was right-handed, easy to miss unless you knew what to look for. I stared at the notebook, trying to process what she was telling me. "You're saying something replaced him?" 3 more paramedics disappeared before that thing moved on to hunt elsewhere. Each time the pattern was the same. They'd break one of the rules, vanish, then reappear changed in some fundamental way. You want to know why I'm still alive after 23 years? Because I follow every single rule in that book. Every single one. She leaned forward and I could smell the tobacco on her breath mixed with something else. Fear, maybe, or desperation. I've seen things in these mountains that would make you question reality itself. I've watched good people disappear and evil things take their place. I've heard voices on the radio from paramedics who died decades ago, still trying to warn us about dangers we can't comprehend. The rational part of my brain, the part trained in evidence-based medicine and scientific method, wanted to laugh. Wanted to walk out and find a normal job with normal dangers like drug dealers and gang violence. But something in Meredith's eyes stopped me. She wasn't lying. Whatever she'd experienced had marked her in ways that ran deeper than scars. The pay really is excellent, she continued, as if reading my thoughts. Hazard pay, they call it, though they don't specify what the hazards are. Health insurance, retirement benefits, and if you last a full year, there's a bonus that'll pay off those student loans you're carrying. How did she know about my loans? I hadn't mentioned them to anyone. Small town, she said, noticing my expression. Word travels fast. We know you need this job, Connor. Question is, are you willing to do what it takes to survive it? I should have left. Should have walked out, driven back to Atlanta, and found work at another trauma center. Instead, I heard myself say, I'll stay. But I'm not abandoning patients because of ghost stories. Meredith's smile was sadder than any tears I'd ever seen. They all say that. The first week passed quietly. Too quietly in retrospect. We handled routine calls. A farmer with chest pain who turned out to have severe heartburn. An elderly woman who'd fallen and bruised her hip. A teenager who'd crashed his ATV and needed stitches. Normal emergencies with normal people who looked like themselves and spoke with their own voices. But I began to notice things. The way certain roads felt different at specific times of day. How some houses seemed to lean away from the light, their windows dark, even in broad daylight. The subtle wrongness in the air before we arrived at certain locations, like the atmospheric pressure dropping before a storm. Meredith watched me constantly, evaluating my reactions, testing my adherence to protocols that had nothing to do with medical training. She made me carry iron nails in my left pocket. Cold iron disrupts their influence, she explained. She insisted we take specific routes to certain addresses, even when GPS suggested faster alternatives. And she made me memorize the rules until I could recite them in my sleep. The mountains are watching you, she said during one of our training sessions. They're learning your patterns, your weaknesses, your psychological profile. They're patient. They've been here for millions of years, and they'll be here long after we're gone. But they're also curious about newcomers. They like to test boundaries. On my 8th day, we got our first supernatural call. Heart attack on Sulphur Creek Road. Textbook emergency that I'd handled hundreds of times in Atlanta. Elderly male, 67 years old. Chest pain and difficulty breathing. We loaded into the ambulance and headed into hills that seemed to lean in and whisper as we passed. Sulphur Creek Road was a narrow ribbon of cracked asphalt that wound between towering pines and ancient oaks. The trees pressed close on both sides, their branches forming a canopy so thick that even afternoon sunlight barely penetrated. Houses were few and far between, mostly trailers and small frame homes that looked like they'd been abandoned and reoccupied multiple times. The address led to a farmhouse that had probably been white once but had faded to the colour of old bones. Paint hung in strips like dead skin, and the front porch sagged under the weight of accumulated decades. Old appliances, rusted farm equipment, newspapers that had probably been sitting there since the Carter administration. But something felt wrong the moment we stepped out of the ambulance. The silence was too complete, No birds, no insects, no wind through the trees. Even our footsteps seemed muffled, as if the air itself was absorbing sound. The patient's wife stood in the doorway, sobbing with theatrical grief, but she faced away from us towards the interior of the house. Her shoulders shook, her wails echoed across the hollow, but she never turned around, never acknowledged our presence. "Rule 11, Meredith whispered as I reached for my medical bag. "If family members won't look at you directly when you arrive, the patient is already gone. Leave immediately." "But she's obviously distressed," I argued, studying the woman's body language. "Her husband could be having a massive coronary in there. Every second counts. Trust the rules, Connor. Always trust the rules." I was about to argue further when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The woman's sobs were too rhythmic, too controlled. They rose and fell in perfect intervals, like a metronome keeping time. And despite the apparent grief, the dramatic gestures, the keening wails, no tears wet her cheeks. Her face was completely dry. She was performing sorrow, not feeling it. "We need to go," Meredith said, already backing toward the ambulance. "Right now." But it was too late. The woman had heard us whispering. She turned around slowly, joints creaking like old hinges, and I felt the world tilt on its axis. The face looking back at me was mine. Not similar, not reminiscent, but identical down to the scar on my chin from a childhood accident I'd never told anyone about. She had my eyes, my nose, even the slight asymmetry where I'd broken my jaw playing high school football. My medical bag hit the ground with a thud that seemed unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. She smiled with my smile, but the expression was wrong, too wide, showing too many teeth. When she spoke, it was with my exact voice, my vocal patterns, my inflections. "Why won't you help me, Connor? He's dying in there. You took an oath, didn't you? First, do no harm." The thing wearing my face stepped forward, moving too fluidly, like it was floating slightly above the ground rather than walking. Its clothes, a floral dress that looked ridiculous on my masculine features, rippled in a wind I couldn't feel. And its eyes, my eyes, held an ancient hunger that had nothing to do with human emotion. "You're just going to leave him to die," it continued, its voice taking on the exact disappointed tone I'd heard in my own voice when talking to incompetent medical students. "What kind of paramedic are you? What kind of man are you?" "Connor, move!" Meredith grabbed my arm and yanked me towards the ambulance. "Don't listen to it." But I was transfixed by the impossibility of what I was seeing. The thing tilted its head at the same angle that I did when I was thinking, ran its hand through its hair the same way I did when I was nervous. It knew me better than I knew myself. "He's suffering in there," it said, pointing towards the darkened doorway behind it, clutching his chest, gasping for air, wondering why the ambulance he called isn't coming to help him. "Is this the kind of paramedic you want to be? The kind who abandons people when they need you most?" Every word hit like a physical blow. This was exactly the kind of moral crisis that had driven me from Atlanta. The feeling that I wasn't doing enough, that I was failing the people who needed me most. "Connor," Meredith's voice cut through my paralysis. "It's not real. None of this is real." That broke the spell. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet in my haste to reach the ambulance. The thing wearing my face watched with amusement, making no attempt to follow. "You'll be back," it called as we climbed into the vehicle. "They always come back. The mountains have a way of calling their children home." Meredith gunned the engine, and we shot down that mountain road like death itself was chasing us. In the rearview mirror, I watched the thing standing in the doorway, waving goodbye with my own hand. It grew smaller and smaller until the road curved and trees blocked our view, but I swear I could still see it waving long after it should have disappeared. "What the hell was that?" I gasped, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird trying to escape. "That," Meredith said, lighting a cigarette with hands that shook like autumn leaves, "is why we have rules. That thing knew your name, knew details about your past that it shouldn't have had access to. If you'd gone into that house, it would have learned everything about you. Your memories, your personality, your entire identity. Then it would have taken your place, and you'd have become one of the things that lurk in these mountains. That's impossible, I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew they were false. I'd seen what I'd seen. It has to be some kind of coincidence, or maybe someone who researched me before I arrived. Connor, that thing knew about a scar you got when you were 8 years old. It replicated your voice so perfectly that if I closed my eyes, I couldn't tell the difference. And most importantly, it knew exactly which psychological buttons to push to make you want to help. She took a long drag from her cigarette. These mountains are old, older than human civilization. They've been watching us for thousands of years, learning our patterns, our weaknesses, our motivations. They've figured out how to hunt us using our own compassion against us. I wanted to argue, to find a rational explanation for what I'd witnessed, but the image of my own face smiling that predatory smile was burned into my memory. What happened to the real patient? Was there actually someone having a heart attack? Probably, Meredith said sadly. There usually is at the beginning. These things feed on genuine tragedy. They find places where real suffering occurred and use it as bait to lure in more victims. The grief was real once, but now it's just an echo, a recording played on an endless loop to draw in anyone foolish enough to try to help. We spent the rest of that shift in silence, taking routine calls that felt surreal after what we'd experienced. A minor traffic accident where both drivers were definitely human. An elderly woman who'd fallen and actually needed medical attention. A teenager with a broken arm from a skateboarding accident who spoke with his own voice and cast a normal shadow. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the shadows between the trees, studying our every move, learning our patterns for future use. Week 2 brought the backwards walker. We were responding to a possible overdose in Beckley around 2 a.m, driving down Route 19 through a section of road that locals called the Devil's Backbone. The asphalt here was newer than the surrounding areas, laid down after some long ago accident had required major reconstruction. Streetlights were few and far between, leaving long stretches of highway shrouded in absolute darkness. I was reviewing the call details. 23-year-old male, found unconscious by roommate. Possible heroin overdose. When our headlights suddenly illuminated something that made my blood freeze. A figure was walking backwards down the yellow center line, moving with an unnatural, flowing gait that defied every law of physics I understood. The person wore a hospital gown that fluttered in the wind, and their bare feet never seemed to quite touch the asphalt. They moved with perfect balance despite walking in reverse, never stumbling or veering from the center line. Rule 16, Meredith muttered, already throwing the ambulance into reverse without slowing down first. The transmission screamed in protest, but she ignored it. If you see someone walking backwards on the road, turn around immediately. Don't ask questions, don't try to help, just get the hell out of there. But they could be a patient, I protested, craning my neck to get a better look at the figure. Maybe they wandered away from a hospital or nursing home. They could be hypothermic, confused, having a psychotic break. We have a duty to help. Look closer, Connor. Really look. I squinted through the windshield as we reversed away from the figure. The person's movements were all wrong. Too smooth, too coordinated for someone walking backwards in the dark. And as I watched, I realized they weren't breathing. Their chests never rose or fell, and in the cold mountain air there should have been visible breath vapor. There was nothing. But as we backed up, our rearview mirror showed something that made my blood turn to ice water. The figure had somehow turned around and was now walking forward, straight toward our ambulance. Its movement was impossibly fast, covering ground that should have taken minutes in mere seconds. "Floor it!" I shouted, but Meredith was already ahead of me. The speedometer needle swept past 60, then 70, as we raced backward down the highway. The figure kept pace effortlessly, its hospital gown streaming behind it like ghostly wings. As it got closer, I could make out more details that violated everything I knew about human anatomy. Its arms were too long, hanging past its knees like those of an ape. Its head swiveled independently of its body, turning to track our movement while its torso continued facing forward, and its face, when the headlights caught it just right, was a blank expanse of flesh with no features at all. Something slammed onto our roof with inhuman strength, the entire ambulance rocking under the impact. The metal groaned and buckled, and I could see dents forming in the ceiling above our heads. Claws or fingernails scraped across the reinforced steel, leaving deep gouges that sparked in the darkness. The sound was like fingernails on a chalkboard amplified 100 times, setting my teeth on edge and making my vision blur. Through the roof, I could hear something that might have been laughter, if laughter could sound like breaking glass in screaming wind. The scratching followed us for 3 miles, occasionally punctuated by impacts that rocked the entire ambulance. Whatever was up there was strong enough to dent steel and fast enough to keep up with our desperate flight. I could feel its weight shifting as we took turns, hear it repositioning itself to maintain its grip. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the scratching stopped. The weight on our roof vanished, and the only sounds were our laboured breathing and the rumble of the engine. Meredith didn't slow down until we reached the outskirts of Beckley, where street lights and traffic signs promised the safety of civilization. "What was that thing?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Meredith admitted, and somehow that was more terrifying than any explanation she could have offered. The backwards walkers started appearing about 5 years ago, always on that stretch of highway, always wearing hospital gowns, always moving against the natural order of things. The state police won't patrol that area anymore, after they lost 2 cruisers and 4 officers. Lost them how? They found the cars wrapped around trees, engines still running, but the officers were never found, just empty uniforms with the badges and nameplates torn off. The investigating team said it looked like the men had simply vanished from inside their clothes, leaving no trace except for scratches on the interior roof of each cruiser. We never did respond to that overdose call. Dispatch had lost contact with the original caller, and when the fire department finally arrived on scene hours later, they found no patient, no emergency, no reason for the call. Just an empty house and a phone that had been disconnected for 6 months. Week 3 introduced me to the children in the woods. We were called to assist an elderly woman who'd fallen in her cabin up on Timber Ridge. Dorothy McGrath, 86 years old, lived alone in a log cabin that her grandfather had built in the 1800s. No electricity, no running water, just oil lamps and a wood-burning stove that filled the single room with warmth and the smell of pine smoke. The cabin was accessible only by a narrow dirt road that wound through old-growth forest, past trees that had been ancient when the first European settlers arrived in these mountains. Some of the oaks were so massive that it would have taken 6 people holding hands to encircle their trunks. Dorothy had slipped while carrying firewood and twisted her ankle, a simple injury that required basic first aid and possibly transport to the hospital for x-rays. But as I examined her ankle in the flickering lamplight, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Children singing. Somewhere in the dark woods surrounding the cabin, young voices were raised in a nursery rhyme I recognized from my own childhood. Ring around the rosy, pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. But the melody was wrong, twisted into a minor key that made the innocent words sound ominous and threatening. And the voices, there were too many of them, dozens of children singing in perfect unison, their voices echoing off the mountain slopes in ways that defied acoustics. "Rule 12, Meredith whispered urgently. "If you hear children playing in the woods, During a night call, do not acknowledge them and do not let them see you looking. But I couldn't help myself. The medical training ingrained in me demanded that I investigate. Children in the woods at midnight, in freezing weather, far from any houses or settlements. They could be lost, injured, suffering from exposure. Every instinct screamed at me to help. I moved towards the cabin's single window, trying to peer into the darkness between the trees. The singing continued, growing louder and more complex. Additional verses I'd never heard before. Words that spoke of graves and bones and things that crawled up from the earth when the moon was dark. "Don't look," Dorothy wheezed from her chair by the stove. Her ankle was forgotten now, overshadowed by something far more dangerous. "Haven't you learned nothing about these mountains yet, boy? Some things are better left unseen." But I was already at the window, cupping my hands around my eyes to block the lamplight's reflection. At first I saw nothing but darkness and the silhouettes of pine trees. Then, gradually, shapes began to resolve in the shadows. They were children, dozens of them, dancing in a circle around a massive oak tree that I hadn't noticed during our approach to the cabin. They wore old-fashioned clothes, wool coats and leather shoes, dresses that might have been fashionable 50 years ago. Their movements were too coordinated, too precise, like marionettes being controlled by a master puppeteer. As I watched, transfixed by the impossible sight, one of the children looked directly at me. Its face was pale as moonlight, and its eyes were empty sockets filled with darkness. It smiled with too many teeth. Not children's teeth, but the sharp, predatory fangs of something that had never been human. The child raised one finger to its lips in a shushing gesture, and the singing stopped abruptly. Dozens of dark eye sockets turned toward the cabin window. They had all seen me looking. "We need to leave," Meredith said, already helping Dorothy to her feet. "Right now. Connor, get away from that window." But the children were moving, breaking their circle and flowing toward the cabin like a tide of shadows. Their movements were wrong. They glided rather than walked, feet never quite touching the ground. And they were fast, covering the distance between the tree and the cabin in heartbeats. We got Dorothy into the ambulance just as the first of them reached our vehicle. Tiny hands pressed against the windows, leaving smudges that looked more like tar than fingerprints. Their faces appeared in the glass, pale and ancient despite their childlike features. They mouthed words I couldn't hear through the reinforced windows, but I understood them anyway. "Play with us, stay with us, join us forever." Meredith gunned the engine, and we lurched away from the cabin with dozens of spectral children clinging to our bumper and roof. They fell away one by one as we gained speed, tumbling into the darkness like discarded dolls. In the rearview mirror, I watched them pick themselves up and continue their eternal dance around that ancient oak. "What were they?" I asked once we'd reached the main road and the familiar comfort of asphalt and telephone poles. "The lost ones," Dorothy said from the stretcher behind us. Her ankle was completely forgotten now, insignificant compared to what we'd just witnessed. Children who wandered into these mountains over the years and never found their way home. Car accidents, hiking trips gone wrong, runaways seeking adventure. The mountains keep them, make them part of the landscape. They're always looking for playmates to join their games. How long have they been there? Since before my grandfather built that cabin in 1847. He used to leave food for them, bread and milk on the porch every full moon, hoping to keep them peaceful. Said it was better to acknowledge them with offerings than to pretend they didn't exist. But you can't look directly at them, can't make eye contact, or they'll never let you go. She paused, staring out the ambulance window at the dark forest sliding past. My grandfather's younger brother made that mistake. Little Tommy, only 6 years old. One night he followed the singing into the woods. They found his clothes the next morning, but never found Tommy. Sometimes on quiet nights you can still hear his voice among the others, singing those old songs and calling for his mama. Week 4 tested my resolve with what became known as the nursing home incident. Sunset Manor was one of those depressing places where hope goes to die, all fluorescent lighting and disinfectant smell that never quite masked the underlying odours of decay and despair. The building squatted on the outskirts of town like a concrete toad, surrounded by parking lots that were never quite full enough to suggest a thriving business. The call was routine. Possible stroke victim, elderly male, unresponsive but breathing. Robert Jameson, 78 years old, found unconscious in his room by a night aide making rounds. Standard protocol: check vitals, assess neurological function, administer appropriate treatment, transport to the hospital. I'd handled dozens of similar cases during my time in Atlanta. Stroke calls were bread and butter for emergency services. Time critical, but manageable if you followed protocols and moved quickly. But the moment we entered Robert's room, I knew something was wrong. The air was too cold, despite the heating system running full blast. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the mechanical wheeze of the ventilation system. And there was a smell, not the usual nursing home cocktail of urine and industrial cleanser, but something organic and sweet, like flowers left too long in a vase. Robert lay in his narrow bed, breathing but unresponsive to verbal stimuli. His colour was good, pulse steady, no obvious signs of distress. I started with the basics: blood pressure, heart rate, respiratory function. Everything seemed normal for a man his age. Then I took his temperature. The digital thermometer beeped and I read the display: 66.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Must be malfunctioning, I muttered, resetting the device and trying again. Hospital-grade equipment was reliable, but occasionally you'd get a bad reading. Second reading, 66.6 degrees Fahrenheit. The number glowed red on the display like an accusation. My hands began to shake as I checked the third time, hoping for a different result. The thermometer beeped cheerfully, oblivious to my growing dread. 66.6 degrees Fahrenheit. 3 identical readings that defied medical possibility and triggered rule number 8. "We leave," Meredith said firmly, already packing our equipment. "Rule 8. When a patient's body temperature reads exactly 66.6 degrees 3 times in a row, abandon the call immediately." "But he needs treatment," I protested, looking down at Robert's peaceful face. "His temperature is dangerously low. He could be hypothermic, septic, going into shock. We can't just abandon him. Connor, move your ass. We're leaving right now." But as we prepared to wheel our stretcher towards the exit, I noticed that other residents had emerged from their rooms. They lined the hallway like a receiving line, all facing our direction, all perfectly silent. Their expressions were blank, curious, as if we were an interesting television program that had captured their attention. As we passed, their heads turned to follow our movement, necks rotating far beyond normal human range. Some turned their heads completely around, 180 degrees, maintaining eye contact as we rushed past. The soft sounds of their necks cracking echoed through the corridor like breaking branches. An elderly woman in a pink bathrobe stood directly in our path. I tried to maneuver around her, but she sidestepped to block us, moving with surprising agility for someone who appeared to be well into her 90s. "You're not leaving, are you?" she asked in a voice like rustling leaves. Her smile revealed teeth that were too sharp, too white for someone her age. "The temperature is perfect for our purposes. 66.6 degrees is the exact temperature at which the human soul becomes malleable, ready to be shaped into something new." She reached out and grabbed my wrist as we tried to pass. Her grip was ice cold and strong as steel cable, her fingers digging into my flesh with inhuman pressure. Her skin felt wrong, too dry, too papery, as if she were already partially mummified. "You'll be back," she whispered, her breath smelling of formaldehyde and roses. They always come back. The mountains have a way of calling their children home. I yanked my arm free, leaving scratches where her fingernails had dug into my skin. We ran for the exit, our equipment rattling on the stretcher, while behind us the residents began to laugh. Not the healthy laughter of elderly people enjoying a joke, but something hollow and echoing, like wind through empty skulls. We reached the ambulance just as the laughter cut off abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete it seemed to muffle even the sound of our own breathing. Every window in the nursing home was filled with faces now, dozens of residents, pressed against the glass, watching our retreat with expressions of infinite patience. "What happens to people who stay?" I asked as we drove away, my hands still shaking from the encounter. "You don't want to know," Meredith replied, but I could see the answer in her haunted eyes. Some knowledge was too terrible to share, too dangerous to speak aloud. Week 5 brought multiple incidents that began to blur together in a cascade of supernatural encounters. The house fire, where flames burned cold and blue, consuming nothing but casting shadows that moved independently of their sources. The firefighters who responded found a structure that was somehow both burning and frozen, ice crystals forming on the windows while blue fire danced harmlessly across the roof. The car accident victim whose injuries healed while we watched, bones knitting together and cuts sealing themselves only to reopen moments later in different patterns. By the time we reached the hospital, he looked exactly as he had when we first found him, trapped and bleeding. The emergency room staff couldn't understand why we'd called it in as a critical trauma when the patient clearly had only minor scrapes. There was the elderly man who claimed his deceased wife was cooking dinner in their kitchen. When we investigated the welfare check, we found a fully prepared meal still warm on the table. Pot roast, mashed potatoes, green beans, even fresh biscuits in a basket covered with a checkered cloth. The food looked delicious, smelled perfect, but when I touched a forkful to my tongue, it tasted like ashes and regret. We later learned the man's wife had been dead for 6 months. We encountered a child who had supposedly fallen from a tree but cast no shadow despite the bright afternoon sun. When I checked his reflexes with my pen light, the beam passed through him as if he were made of mist, though he felt solid enough to touch. His parents thanked us for helping their son, but when we looked back from the ambulance, no one was there. The tree he'd supposedly fallen from was leafless and dead, its branches brittle with decades of neglect. Each incident reinforced the same lesson. These mountains operated according to rules that predated human understanding, laws that had been ancient when the first Native American tribes arrived thousands of years ago. The rules in our notebook weren't just guidelines. They were the accumulated wisdom of everyone who'd managed to survive long enough to pass on their knowledge. But it was the incident at Blackwater Falls that truly opened my eyes to the depth of the supernatural forces at work in these mountains. We responded to a hiking accident on a grey Thursday morning in late May. A college student from Virginia Tech had fallen while photographing the waterfall and suffered what sounded like a serious head injury. The falls were accessible by a narrow trail that wound through old-growth forest, past trees that had been ancient when George Washington was surveying these very mountains. The trail was treacherous, especially after recent rains had made the rocks slippery. Rangers posted warning signs every few hundred yards, but tourists still came, drawn by the beauty of the 60-foot cascade that tumbled into a dark pool surrounded by moss-covered boulders. We found the hiker sitting beside the pool at the base of the falls, conscious but disoriented. Blood trickled from a gash on his forehead, and his pupils were unequal. Classic signs of traumatic brain injury that required immediate transport to a trauma center. But as I examined him, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. His pupils didn't just reflect light. They glowed with their own inner illumination, like an animal caught in headlights. The glow was subtle, easily missed unless you knew what to look for, but once I saw it, I couldn't look away. Rule 3, Meredith whispered behind me. When examining a patient, if their pupils reflect light like an animal's eyes, do not make direct eye contact and complete treatment as quickly as possible. I tried to follow the rule, keeping my gaze focused on his forehead wound while I cleaned and bandaged it. But the patient kept trying to make eye contact, turning his head to follow my movements, speaking in a conversational tone that seemed designed to draw my attention to his face. "You're new here, aren't you?" he said, his voice carrying an odd echo, despite the open air around us. "I can always tell. You still have that city softness, that belief that the world makes sense according to rational principles. These mountains will cure you of that notion soon enough." "Just stay still while I examine you," I said, focusing on his pulse rather than his words. But his heart rate was all wrong. Too slow, too regular, like a metronome, rather than the erratic rhythm of someone who'd just suffered head trauma. "I've been coming to these falls for years," he continued, and something in his tone made me want to look up despite myself. "Photographing the water, documenting the changes, watching the patterns. Do you know what I've learned? Water remembers everything. Every drop that goes over these falls carries the memory of everyone who's ever died in these waters." Against my better judgment, I glanced up and made the mistake of meeting his gaze directly. His pupils weren't just glowing. They were moving, swirling like tiny galaxies of light. And in their depths, I saw faces, dozens of them, mouths open in silent screams, eyes wide with terror and recognition. "You see them too, don't you?" he whispered, and his voice seemed to come from very far away. "All the lost souls who thought they understood these mountains, all the people who broke the rules, who let curiosity override caution." I jerked my gaze away, but it was too late. The connection had been made, the circuit completed. Images began flooding my mind, visions of previous accidents at these falls, bodies pulled from the churning water, search and rescue teams finding nothing but empty clothes and abandoned cameras. "Connor!" Meredith's voice cut through the visions like a knife. "Don't look at him. Finish the bandage and let's go." I completed the treatment with shaking hands, keeping my eyes fixed on his forehead wound. But I could feel his gaze burning into me, and with it came a terrible understanding. The hiking accident hadn't been an accident at all. He'd been pushed or pulled or called by something that lived in the depths of that dark pool. As we loaded him onto the stretcher, he leaned close and whispered in my ear, "You've seen them now, the faces in the water. They'll be waiting for you, Connor. They know your name now. They know your face, and they're patient, so very patient." During transport to the hospital, his vital signs normalized. His pupils returned to their natural color, and by the time we arrived at the emergency room, he seemed like any other head injury patient. The attending physician found no signs of serious trauma beyond the superficial laceration, and he was released after a few hours of observation. But I couldn't shake the memory of those swirling lights, those screaming faces trapped in his eyes. And every time I drove past Blackwater Falls after that, I could swear I saw figures moving beneath the surface of the dark water, reaching upward with pale, grasping hands. Week 6 brought the radio incident that nearly broke my sanity completely. We were dispatched to a multi-vehicle accident on Deadman's Curve, a notorious stretch of highway where the mountain road twisted like a serpent through a series of hairpin turns. The name wasn't just colourful local folklore. More people had died on that mile of asphalt than on any other road in the county. As Meredith reached for the radio to confirm our response, my own voice crackled through the speaker with crystal clarity. "Unit 47, we're on scene. We need additional units immediately. There are so many bodies. Oh God, there are so many bodies. They're still moving. They're still trying to crawl away from the wreckage. The blood is everywhere. And they're not staying dead. Every time we pronounce someone, they start breathing again, but their eyes, Their eyes are all wrong. The transmission dissolved into static, then resumed with my voice again, but different somehow. Older, more tired, filled with a despair that seemed to echo from the depths of hell itself. "This is Connor Blake, Unit 47. If anyone receives this transmission, do not respond to Deadman's Curve. It's a trap. They use our voices against us, make us think we're helping, but we're just feeding them. The accidents aren't accidents. The mountains are hungry, and they're using us to deliver their meals." A third voice joined the transmission, also mine, but speaking with the flat affect of someone in deep shock. "Day 127, still responding to calls, still trying to help. But I'm starting to understand that we're not really helping anyone. We're just part of the ecosystem now, part of the food chain. The mountains consume everything. Hope, sanity, souls, and we keep bringing them fresh victims." The radio fell silent. We stared at the device in stunned silence, both of us afraid to speak, afraid that our words might somehow be captured and used against future victims. "That was your voice," Meredith said quietly, her face pale, in the dashboard light. "That's impossible. We haven't even left the station yet. Those transmissions were talking about things that haven't happened." Rule 9. If your radio starts broadcasting voices that shouldn't exist, drive to the nearest running water immediately and stay there until sunrise. Without another word, Meredith yanked the steering wheel hard left, tires squealing as we veered off the highway toward Copper Creek. She drove straight into the shallow water, our ambulance lurching to a stop with the creek flowing around our tires, the current rippling silver in our headlights. The radio went dead the moment we entered the water. Not just silent, completely dead, as if the electrical current had been cut. Even the static disappeared, leaving behind a silence so complete it made our ears ring. "Why water?" I asked, trying to make sense of what was happening to us. "Running water breaks the connection," Meredith explained, lighting a cigarette with hands that trembled like autumn leaves. "Whatever forces are at work in these mountains, they can't cross moving water. It's like a barrier, a natural firewall that blocks their influence. Native Americans knew it, early settlers learned it, and we've rediscovered it through trial and error." We sat there for 3 hours, watching the creek flow around our vehicle, listening to the silence where our radio had been. The water was so clear, I could see trout moving lazily in the deeper pools, their movements calm and natural in a way that seemed almost miraculous after the supernatural chaos we'd been experiencing. As dawn approached, the first pale light filtering through the mountain peaks, the radio suddenly crackled back to life. Normal chatter from dispatch and other units filled the airwaves. Routine calls, status updates, the comfortable background noise of a functioning emergency services system. When we finally responded to the original call at Deadman's Curve, we found no accident. No wreckage, no bodies, no other emergency vehicles. Just an empty stretch of highway. Under the pale morning sun, and a family of deer grazing peacefully in the meadow beyond the guardrail. But burned into the asphalt, visible only from certain angles when the light was just right, were tire marks that spelled out words in perfect cursive script. "Welcome home, Connor." By month 3, I'd started to believe. Not gradually, not reluctantly, but with the sudden, terrifying clarity of someone who'd been walking in darkness and suddenly saw the cliff edge inches from their feet. The rules weren't hazing or superstition. They were survival instructions written in blood and terror by people who'd learned the hard way that these mountains played by different laws than the rest of the world. I followed them religiously now, carried iron nails in my left pocket as instructed, avoided certain roads during specific hours, and never questioned Meredith's judgment when she said we needed to leave a call immediately. It kept me alive, but it also changed me in ways I was only beginning to understand. Month 4 brought changes I didn't expect and couldn't have prepared for. I began to notice things that weren't in the rulebook. patterns and signs that Meredith had never mentioned. The way certain roads felt different at specific times of day. Not just darker or quieter, but wrong in some fundamental way that made my skin crawl. How some houses seemed to lean away from the light, their windows dark even in broad daylight, as if they were allergic to illumination. Most disturbing was the subtle wrongness I could sense in the air before supernatural encounters. It was like a change in atmospheric pressure before a storm, but deeper, more visceral. My body would react before my mind understood what was happening. Hair standing on end, muscles tensing, an almost overwhelming urge to flee. "You're developing the sensitivity," Meredith observed, after I correctly predicted that a routine medical call would turn supernatural. We'd been dispatched to check on an elderly man who hadn't been seen by neighbours for several days. I'd felt the wrongness before we even reached his street, and sure enough, we found his house filled with clocks that had all stopped at exactly 3:17 a.m. "It happens to everyone who survives long enough," she continued as we drove away from the house without entering. "The mountains change you, make you part of their ecosystem. It's not always a blessing." She was right. The enhanced awareness came with a price that went far beyond the obvious discomfort of sensing supernatural threats. I began having dreams about calls we hadn't taken yet, visions of accidents that wouldn't happen for days or weeks. The dreams were vivid, detailed and absolutely accurate. I would see specific injuries, hear exact conversations, witness events that wouldn't occur until later. Sleep became elusive, interrupted by nightmares filled with backwards voices and children who sang lullabies in dead languages. I would wake at 3:17 a.m., always that exact time, with the absolute certainty that something was watching me from the corner of my bedroom, something that vanished the moment I turned on the lights. During the day, I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, shapes that vanished when I turned to look directly at them. Shadows fell at wrong angles, and reflections in windows sometimes showed things that weren't there. My apartment felt less like home and more like a temporary shelter, as if I were camping in hostile territory. The worst part was the voices. Late at night, when the station was quiet and Meredith was asleep in the bunk room, I would hear conversations coming from our radio. Not dispatches or official communications, but personal discussions between paramedics who had died years ago, their voices trapped in the electromagnetic spectrum like ghosts in the machine. They talked about calls they'd never completed, patients they'd failed to save, rules they'd broken in moments of weakness or compassion. Their conversations were fragments of lives cut short, echoes of hopes and fears that death hadn't been able to silence. Sometimes they mentioned my name. "The new kids lasted longer than most," one voice would say, a woman's voice, tired and sad. 3 months and counting. Think he'll make it to his first anniversary?" "Doubtful," another would reply, this one male with a slight southern accent. "He's got that look in his eyes that need to help people. Compassion's a killer in these mountains. Always has been." "David Chen had the same look," a third voice would add. "Brilliant kid, but he couldn't accept that sometimes the best help you can give is to run away. The backwards walker got him in the end." "They all break eventually," the first voice would conclude. "The rules work, but only if you can follow them, when it really matters. When everything in your training tells you to help. When your conscience screams that you're abandoning someone who needs you. That's when the mountains test you." I tried turning off the radio, disconnecting it, even removing the batteries. Nothing worked. The voices continued, always just barely audible, like conversations overheard through thin walls. Month 5 brought the incident at the abandoned mineshaft that made me realize just how deep and complex the supernatural ecosystem of these mountains really was. We were called to assist with a search and rescue operation. A group of urban explorers from Richmond had entered the old Copperhead mine, looking for interesting photographs and hadn't been seen for 3 days. The mine had been closed since 1987, after a series of accidents that killed 17 miners, but that hadn't stopped adventurous trespassers from exploring its tunnels. The mine entrance was a concrete portal set into the mountainside, sealed with heavy steel doors that someone had cut open with industrial tools. Warning signs covered every surface: danger, unstable structure, no trespassing, authorized personnel only. But someone had spray-painted additional warnings in red letters that looked disturbingly like dried blood. They're still singing down there, and don't follow the lights. The search and rescue coordinator was a grizzled fire chief named Murphy, who'd been running operations in these mountains for over 30 years. He briefed us on the situation with the weary professionalism of someone who'd seen too much and hoped for too little. 5 college kids from Virginia Tech, he said, consulting his clipboard. They had permits for some kind of photography project about abandoned industrial sites, left their cars in the parking area 3 days ago, and haven't been seen since. Their cell phones are going straight to voicemail, and we haven't been able to raise them on the emergency radios they were supposed to carry. Standard protocol called for us to remain at the entrance as medical support while the rescue teams explored the mine tunnels. But as we waited, setting up our equipment and preparing for potential casualties, I began to hear something that made my blood run cold. Singing, faint but unmistakable, echoing up from the depths of the mine shaft. Men's voices raised in harmony, performing what sounded like an old mining song about cave-ins and lost souls. The melody was haunting, beautiful in a way that made your chest ache with inexplicable sadness. "You hear that too?" I asked Meredith, but she was already pulling out the rulebook. "Rule 18, she read aloud. "If you hear singing coming from underground, do not investigate and do not enter any subterranean space. The song is a trap designed to lure victims deeper into places where rescue is impossible." But the rescue teams had already entered the mine, following their protocol and carrying their equipment into the darkness. Through our radio, we could hear their progress reports. Team 1 proceeding down the main shaft, no sign of the victims yet, but we're following fresh footprints. Team 2 exploring the eastern tunnels, found some abandoned photography equipment but no people. The singing grew louder, more compelling. The harmonies were perfect, the voices blending in ways that human vocal cords shouldn't be able to achieve. And beneath the melody, I could hear other sounds. The scrape of boots on stone, the creak of old timber supports, the drip of water in hidden chambers. "Base camp, this is Team 1. The radio crackled with the search leader's voice. "We're hearing music down here. Sounds like the missing students might have brought some kind of audio equipment. We're following the sound." "Negative, Team 1, Murphy responded immediately. "The students' gear inventory didn't include any music players. Exercise extreme caution and consider withdrawal." But it was too late. The singing had already done its work, drawing the rescue teams deeper into the mine's labyrinthine passages. Their radio reports became sporadic, filled with static and strange echoes that made their voices sound hollow and distorted. "Base camp, Team 2, we found them. The students..." The transmission cut to static, then resumed with a different voice, younger and more frightened. "Please help us. We're lost in the tunnels. The singing won't stop, and there are lights moving in the darkness. They're not headlamps. They're something else, something that pulses like a heartbeat." More static, then silence. We waited for 6 hours while additional rescue teams prepared to enter the mine. Murphy called in specialists from 3 counties, brought in advanced communications equipment, even contacted the state police for additional support. But as evening approached, something happened that no amount of preparation could have prevented. The steel doors began to close by themselves. Not slowly, not gradually, but with sudden mechanical precision. The massive barriers ground shut with a sound like breaking bones, the metal groaning under stresses that should have been impossible. No amount of equipment could force them open again. They had sealed as completely as if they'd been welded in place by some supernatural forge. The official report listed 8 people missing and presumed dead in a mine collapse, but the locals knew better. Sometimes on quiet nights when the wind was just right, you could still hear singing, echoing from the sealed entrance. The voices had multiplied, adding new harmonies to their eternal chorus. Murphy retired the following week, putting in his papers after 30 years of distinguished service. I've seen cave-ins, explosions, floods and fires, he told me over drinks at a local bar, his hands shaking as he raised his glass. But I've never seen doors close by themselves. Voices don't sing in empty mines, but I heard what I heard, and I'm not going back into any cave or tunnel ever again. He moved to Florida a month later, as far from the mountains as he could get. His replacement, a young fire chief fresh from training, lasted exactly 3 weeks before requesting a transfer to a different county. Month 6 brought a false sense of security that I now recognize as the most dangerous period of my entire time in these mountains. I'd been following the rules religiously, and they'd kept me alive through encounters that should have been fatal. I carried iron nails in my left pocket, avoided Crow Mountain during the forbidden hours, turned away from houses where clocks had stopped, and it worked. The supernatural elements that had claimed so many others passed me by, frustrated by my adherence to the protective protocols. But confidence, as I've mentioned before, is dangerous in these mountains. Deadly dangerous. The calls during month 6 seemed almost routine compared to what I'd experienced earlier. A heart attack that was actually a heart attack, with normal symptoms and predictable responses to treatment. A car accident with injuries that stayed injured, bleeding that responded to pressure bandages, and patients who spoke with their own voices. I began to relax, to think that maybe I'd learned enough to navigate these mountains safely. The supernatural encounters became less frequent, less intense. Some days we'd complete entire shifts without encountering anything that violated natural law. Meredith noticed my growing confidence and tried to warn me, but I was too cocky to listen properly. "The moment you think you've got it figured out," she said during one of our routine equipment checks, "that's when they get you. Overconfidence has killed more people in these mountains than ignorance ever did. The rules work, but only if you follow them with the proper respect and fear." I should have listened. Should have remembered that every rule in our notebook was written in blood by someone who thought they understood the dangers they faced. Instead, I became cocky, started making jokes about the supernatural encounters, referring to the rules as mountain folklore when talking to other emergency personnel. I even suggested that maybe some of the incidents had rational explanations that we'd simply missed in our fear and confusion. The mountains were listening. They're always listening. I started taking small liberties with the rules, not breaking them outright, but bending them when I thought I could get away with it. Staying out a few minutes past the forbidden times, getting a little closer to dangerous situations than the protocols recommended, questioning Meredith's judgment when she insisted we leave calls immediately. "You're getting sloppy," she warned me after a particularly close call involving a patient whose temperature had read 66.5 degrees, close enough to the trigger point to make us both nervous. Sloppy gets you dead in these mountains. But I thought I knew better. I thought 6 months of experience made me an expert on supernatural survival. I thought I could trust my instincts over the accumulated wisdom of decades. I was wrong, so completely, catastrophically wrong. October 13th, Thursday night. The date should have been warning enough. Friday the 13th gets all the attention, but Thursday the 13th has its own malevolent significance in these mountains. The locals avoid unnecessary travel. Businesses close early and smart people stay home with their doors locked and their lights on. But I was feeling confident, invulnerable. We'd made it through 6 months without losing a single patient to supernatural causes, and I was proud of our record. I'd started thinking of myself as someone who could handle anything these mountains could throw at me. The mountains were about to teach me how wrong I was. 10:47 p.m, the radio crackled to life with a call that would change everything. Unit 47, respond to Ravens Hollow Road, mile marker 13. Single vehicle accident. Driver trapped. Possible fatalities. Meredith immediately grabbed the rulebook. Flipping to the page I knew by heart. Mile marker 13 was covered under Rule 13. If you see a hitchhiker on mile marker 13 who looks exactly like you, do not stop under any circumstances. Floor the accelerator and don't look back. But this wasn't a hitchhiker report. This was a legitimate emergency call with specific details and a clear location. Someone was trapped in a vehicle, possibly dying while we debated protocol. "We can't respond," Meredith said, but I could hear the conflict in her voice. 23 years of following the rules, warring against 23 years of wanting to help people. Rule 13 is absolute. Nothing good happens at mile marker 13 after dark. But it's not about a hitchhiker, I argued, feeling that familiar surge of medical urgency. It's a traffic accident. Someone could be bleeding out while we sit here following superstitious rules. The radio crackled again with additional information. Unit 47, be advised we have confirmed entrapment. Driver is conscious and screaming for help. Fire department is 20 minutes out due to equipment failure. You're the closest unit. Through the static, we could hear it, genuine human terror and pain. A man's voice, raw with agony, begging for someone to help him. It was the most heartbreaking sound I'd ever heard, and it cut through every supernatural warning bell in my head. "Please," the voice screamed through the radio. "I can't feel my legs. There's blood everywhere. Please don't leave me to die alone." My medical training overrode everything else. This was why I became a paramedic, to help people in their darkest moments, to be the difference between life and death. How could I live with myself knowing I'd let someone die because of mountain folklore? "We have to respond," I said, reaching for the ignition keys. "I don't care what the rules say. There's a real person dying out there." "Connor, no." Meredith grabbed my wrist with surprising strength, her fingers digging into my flesh. "I've been doing this for 23 years. I've seen what happens to people who break Rule 13. It's not worth the risk." "What if it was your son out there?" I asked, knowing it was cruel but unable to stop myself. "What if it was someone you loved, trapped and bleeding and screaming for help?" It was a low blow, and I knew it. Meredith had lost her only son in a car accident 5 years earlier. Not supernatural, just a drunk driver who ran a red light at the wrong moment. The pain was still raw, still visible in her eyes whenever she thought no one was looking. Her grip loosened, and I saw the exact moment when her professional judgment gave way to maternal instinct. The same compassion that made her an excellent paramedic became the weakness that would doom us both. "One response," she said quietly, her voice heavy with resignation. "We check it out from a safe distance. If anything seems wrong, anything at all, we leave immediately. Promise me, Connor. Promise me you won't take any unnecessary risks." I promised, meaning it at the time. But promises made in safety are easy to break when faced with human suffering. As we drove towards Ravens Hollow, every rule in the book seemed to activate at once, as if the mountains were throwing everything they had at us in one final test. Dense fog rolled in from nowhere, thick as cotton, and moving against the wind. Our radio started crackling with backwards voices speaking in languages that predated human speech. The temperature gauge showed exactly 66.6 degrees, despite the warm October evening. Our headlights illuminated a figure walking backwards down the road, a woman in a hospital gown whose feet never touched the asphalt. She turned as we passed, and I caught a glimpse of Meredith's face on the backwards walker's body. The thing wearing my partner's appearance smiled and waved as we drove by. "Turn round," Meredith pleaded, her voice thick with terror. "Please, Connor, this is a trap. This is exactly how they get you. Every warning sign is active. We're driving straight into hell." But the screaming on the radio continued, growing more desperate with each passing moment. I could hear the genuine pain, the mortal terror of someone facing death alone. My medical training, my entire sense of purpose demanded that I help. "Just 5 more minutes," I said, pressing harder on the accelerator. "If we don't find anything in 5 minutes, we'll turn around and head back to base." Mile marker 13 appeared in our headlights like a tombstone, marking the boundary between the rational world and something far more dangerous. Beyond it, our headlights revealed the accident. A blue sedan wrapped around an ancient oak tree, steam rising from the crumpled hood, like incense from a sacrificial altar. The scene looked completely legitimate. The damage pattern was consistent with a high-speed collision. Broken glass glittered on the asphalt like scattered diamonds. The front end of the car was compressed almost to the windshield, and I could see a figure trapped inside, bloodied, but moving. "Help me," the victim called out as we approached, his voice hoarse from screaming. "Please, I can't feel my legs. I think my spine is broken. There's so much blood." Every detail seemed authentic. The way he was positioned in the driver's seat, the pattern of injuries visible through the cracked windshield, even the smell of gasoline and hot metal that filled the air around the wreckage. By every medical and logical standard, this was exactly the kind of call we'd trained for, but something made me look more closely at the scene. Some instinct that had been honed by 6 months of supernatural encounters. The road surface was wrong. No skid marks led up to the tree, no indication that the driver had tried to brake or swerve before impact. The asphalt was pristine, unmarked by the violent physics of a high-speed crash. The tree itself showed no damage. The bark was intact, unscratched by the metal that had supposedly slammed into it at lethal velocity. Even the lowest branches were undisturbed, their leaves still attached and unstirred by any impact. "Meredith," I said quietly, trying not to let the trapped driver hear my growing suspicion. "Look at the scene. Really look at it." She followed my gaze, her experienced eyes taking in the details I'd noticed. "No skid marks," she whispered. "No tree damage, no debris field. It's like the car was placed here." "It's a trap," I realized, but the words came too late. The victim in the car had heard our whispered conversation. He turned his head toward us, movement that should have been impossible if his spine was truly injured, and I felt my blood turn to ice water. It was my own face staring back at me, but not just any version of my face. It was me exactly as I'd appeared 5 years earlier, down to the specific injuries I'd sustained in a car accident that had nearly ended my medical career. The same cuts above the left eyebrow where my head had struck the side window. The same bruised and swollen cheekbone from the airbag deployment. The same torn flannel shirt I'd been wearing that night, now soaked with blood that looked fresh despite the years that had passed. "Help me, Connor," he said, and the voice was mine. Not similar to mine, but my exact vocal patterns, my inflections, the way I sounded when I was scared and in pain. "Don't let me die like this. You know what it's like to be trapped, to be helpless, to think you're going to die alone in twisted metal." He was right. I did know exactly what it felt like. The memory of my own accident was still vivid. The moment of impact when a drunk driver ran a red light and slammed into my car. The crushing weight of the steering wheel against my chest. The taste of blood in my mouth. The certainty that I was going to die in that wreckage before anyone could reach me. It had taken the fire department 45 minutes to cut me free. 45 minutes of agony and terror that had motivated my decision to become a paramedic. I wanted to be the person on the other side of that equation, the one who arrived to help instead of the one who needed saving. You remember, don't you? The thing wearing my face continued, its voice taking on the exact tone I used when I was trying to be persuasive. The fear, the pain, the desperate hope that someone would come to help you. Someone did help you that night. The paramedics, who cut you free, who kept you alive during transport, who made sure you lived to save other people. Don't you owe the same compassion to others? Rule 13 screamed in my head. If you see someone at mile marker 13 who looks exactly like you, do not stop under any circumstances. But everything about the situation felt wrong, in a way that went beyond supernatural warnings. This wasn't just about following rules. This was a test of everything I believed, about medicine, compassion, and human obligation. Connor, we need to leave, Meredith said urgently, already backing toward the ambulance. Right now, this is exactly what Rule 13 warns against. But I couldn't move. The trapped version of myself continued speaking, its words hitting every psychological button I possessed. You took an oath, Connor. First, do no harm. But how much harm are you doing by abandoning someone who needs help? What kind of paramedic are you if you run away when things get difficult? What kind of man are you if you let fear override compassion? The words stung because they echoed my own thoughts, my own doubts about following rules that sometimes meant abandoning people who might genuinely need help. Every supernatural encounter we'd fled could have been someone in real distress that we'd left to suffer or die. You're not real, I said, but the words came out weak and uncertain. I'm as real as you are, it replied, and blood began flowing more freely from its wounds. I'm you 5 years ago, trapped and dying, and praying for someone to care enough to help. Are you going to abandon yourself, Connor? Are you going to let yourself die? Behind me, I could hear Meredith starting the ambulance engine, preparing to leave with or without me. But I couldn't abandon what might be a genuine victim, even if that victim wore my face and spoke with my voice. My medical training, my sense of human decency, my entire identity as a healer demanded that I act. I approached the car with the jaws of life in hand. The moment I touched the door handle, reality fractured like safety glass hit with a hammer. The sedan didn't just disappear, it dissolved, breaking apart into constituent atoms that scattered on a wind I couldn't feel. The tree remained ancient and undamaged, its roots running deep into soil that had been soaked with blood for centuries. The thing that had been pretending to be me stepped away from where the car had been, no longer injured, no longer trapped, no longer even pretending to be human. It smiled with my face, but the expression was wrong. Too wide, showing too many teeth, filled with a hunger that had nothing to do with human appetite. Thank you, it said in my voice. Thank you for choosing compassion over wisdom. Thank you for proving that human nature never changes, that you'll always choose to help, even when helping means destroying yourselves. Behind it, the fog began to part, revealing dozens more figures emerging from the darkness between the trees. They were all me, different ages, different versions, different choices and paths. There was Connor, the successful surgeon who'd never left medical school. Connor, the burned-out addict who'd never gotten clean. Connor, the family man with wife and children I'd never had. All the lives I might have lived, all the roads I hadn't taken, all the possibilities that existed in parallel to my reality. And they were all hungry to take my place. Every choice creates a fork in the road, the original imposter explained, as the others began to circle me like wolves. Every decision spawns alternatives, other versions of yourself, living different lives in different realities. Most of the time, these alternatives remain separate, invisible, unable to interact with your world. But here, in places where the barriers are thin, where the mountains remember older laws than physics, we can cross over. I tried to run, but where could I go? They knew every move I would make because they were me. Every escape route I considered, they had already anticipated. Every weakness I possessed, they shared. Every fear that drove me, they understood completely. "The mountains have been watching you for months," another version of myself said, this one wearing a lab coat stained with substances I didn't want to identify. "Learning your patterns, your psychology, your breaking point. They knew exactly how to bait the trap, with genuine human suffering, with moral crisis, with the one thing you couldn't ignore." "Meredith!" I shouted, hoping my partner could somehow save me. But when I looked toward the ambulance, I saw something that made my heart stop. Another version of me was climbing into the driver's seat, this one dressed in a paramedic uniform, identical to mine. It looked exactly like me, moved like me, even wore the same scratches on its hands from the fake car accident. Meredith couldn't tell the difference. In the darkness and confusion, she thought I had returned to the ambulance as planned. "You broke the rules," the original imposter said, its voice now echoing from multiple throats as all the alternate versions of myself spoke in unison. "Now we get to live instead of you. We get to experience the reality you're throwing away, the life you're too foolish to protect." They swarmed me like locusts, each one trying to crawl inside my skin, to wear my identity like a suit of clothes that had always belonged to them. Their hands were cold as winter earth, and they smelled of grave dirt and broken promises. As they pulled me down, I could feel pieces of myself being torn away. Memories, experiences, the very essence of who I was. I fought back with everything I had, throwing punches at faces that mirrored my own, kicking at bodies that moved with my mannerisms. But they were stronger, faster, and they knew exactly how I would react because they were me. Every defensive move I made, they countered perfectly. Every attack I launched, they anticipated completely. "This is how it always ends," they whispered in my voice as they dragged me toward the darkness between the trees. "This is how it ended for all the others who thought they could break the rules without consequences. Your compassion is your weakness, Connor. Your desire to help is the very thing that destroys you." As they pulled me into whatever hell waited beyond the fog, I understood the truth that Meredith had tried to teach me. The rules weren't just guidelines or superstitions. They were the accumulated wisdom of everyone who'd learned the hard way that these mountains operated according to laws that predated human understanding. Every rule in that bloodstained notebook had been written by someone who'd made the same choice I made, someone who'd put their medical training above supernatural survival. The different handwritings weren't from different paramedics. They were from different versions of the same story, played out across different realities, all of us making the same fatal mistake at mile marker 13. David Chen, my predecessor, hadn't been torn apart by the backwards walker. He'd been replaced by it, just as I was being replaced now. The thing wearing his appearance had continued working, following protocols, acting completely normal until it could lure the next victim into making the same mistake. And now it was my turn to become the bait. The last thing I saw before they dragged me completely into the darkness was my replacement climbing into the ambulance with Meredith. It looked exactly like me, wore my uniform, even carried my medical bag, but its eyes held the cold hunger of something that had never been human, something that understood compassion only as a weapon to be used against its victims. Meredith drove away, never suspecting that the man sitting beside her wasn't the partner she'd tried to save. The thing wearing my face would study my memories, learn my mannerisms, perfect its impersonation, until even I wouldn't be able to tell the difference. Time works differently in the space between dimensions. I've been here for what feels like centuries, watching through windows that aren't quite windows as my replacement integrates itself into my life. It's been working with Meredith for months now, learning everything there is to know about being a paramedic in these supernatural mountains. It follows the rules perfectly, never makes mistakes. never shows the human weakness that led to my downfall. But I can see the signs that Meredith is starting to notice. Small inconsistencies, subtle changes in behavior that accumulate over time, like sediment in a riverbed. The thing wearing my face is too perfect, too controlled. It never gets frustrated with difficult patients, never shows fear during supernatural encounters, never displays the emotional vulnerability that made me human. It's learning to mimic humanity, but it can't truly understand it. Soon there will be a new trainee, young, eager, full of noble intentions and medical school idealism. Someone who believes that modern medicine and rational thinking can overcome any challenge, who sees these mountain folk as backward and superstitious. And I'll be the one handing them the bloodstained notebook, adding my own rule in fresh red ink. Rule 20, if your partner dies at mile marker 13, but climbs back into the ambulance, that's not your partner anymore. Run. But they never listen. They never follow the rules. Medical training overrides common sense every single time. They see someone who needs help, and they help. Consequences be damned. The oath they swore, the compassion that drew them to medicine in the first place becomes the very thing that destroys them. I've watched it happen 17 times now. 17 young paramedics who thought they knew better, who believed their training and good intentions could overcome forces that existed before the first human drew breath on this continent. Each one followed the same pattern: initial skepticism, gradual acceptance, growing confidence, and finally the fatal mistake that brought them here to join the chorus of the damned. The mountains are patient. They've been hunting humans for millennia, perfecting their techniques, learning our weaknesses. They know that compassion is our greatest strength and our most exploitable flaw. They use our desire to help against us, turning our virtues into weapons of our own destruction. And that's how the cycle continues forever in these ancient Appalachian mountains that remember everything and forgive nothing. The mountains that are older than bones, older than memory, older than the very concept of mercy. I broke one rule, just one, and now I'm paying the price for eternity, watching as each new paramedic makes the same choice I made, falls into the same trap I fell into, becomes another voice in the backwards radio transmissions that warn future victims who won't listen. The screaming has stopped. The metal doors hang open like broken wings. In the distance, I can hear the radio crackling with a familiar voice, my own voice, calling for backup that will never come, starting the cycle that will claim another victim. Unit 47 responding to Raven's Hollow Road. The words echo through dimensions, carried on electromagnetic waves that bridge the gap between the world of the living and whatever realm holds the souls of those who broke the rules. Soon there will be a new voice joining the chorus, another paramedic who thought compassion was stronger than caution. But for now I wait and watch and remember the moment when my desire to help became the instrument of my own destruction. The moment when I learned that in these mountains, the road to hell truly is paved with good intentions. From my prison between worlds, I can see the new recruit arriving at the station, fresh-faced, idealistic, carrying the same mixture of confidence and compassion that doomed me. The thing wearing my face greets him with my smile, shakes his hand with my grip, speaks with my voice as it begins the process of breaking him down. "Welcome to Mountain Ridge Emergency Services," it says. "These mountains can be challenging, but I'm sure you'll do fine. Just remember to follow the rules, and you'll be okay." It hands him the blood-stained notebook, now containing 20 rules instead of 19. My contribution to the collection, written in my own blood during those first desperate hours in this dimensional prison. The cycle begins again, as it always does, as it always will. Because in these mountains, every ending is also a beginning. Every death births a new hunter, and every act of compassion plants the seeds of its own betrayal. The mountains are hungry. They're always hungry. And we keep feeding them, one good intention at a time.